Thank you, James. We're really excited to have Dr. Brad Wilcox joining us today. He's the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, and in his latest work, he's done, soulmates, religion, sex, love, and marriage among African Americans and Latinos, which speaks to the Family Bridges work because we work with so many Latinos and underserved communities. And also he has quite a breadth of research on marriage, fatherhood, cohabitation, especially in the way it's about family structure, civil society, and culture. So he's just constantly being quoted and published in many journals, both nationally and worldwide. So his research has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the National Review, NPR, NBC, the Today Show, and many other media outlets. And so we're really excited to hear from him in terms of this topic, the silver lining. And I'm going to turn it over to Brad and let him take it away.
Alicia, thanks for having me here today to talk to you about the silver lining. But before I get to that point, I want to obviously acknowledge that there are many, many dark clouds, to continue that metaphor, on the horizon, as this opening slide suggests, because we're really kind of living here today in an unprecedented moment. It's obviously the worst pandemic in a century. It's probably the worst recession we're going to see in our lifetimes, and probably the worst governmental paralysis in the face of a major challenge we've also kind of seen in our lifetimes as well. So, a lot has gone wrong for the country and for our society. And when it comes to sort of thinking about the impact of COVID on our families, I mean, we can think obviously of tens of thousands of Americans dying in recent weeks, particularly our grandparents. We've obviously seen millions of parents across the US losing jobs. And, for most of us, there are certainly, many a spell of cabin fever that can make family life difficult. We've got a couple of teens at home, and they've really been climbing the walls of late, for instance. So there are obvious ways in which this pandemic is exacting a big price for American families. And more concretely, I think we can recognize that particularly for many working class and poor families, with job losses, looming large, there are obvious implications for the quality and stability of family life. We know, for instance, that when men lose their jobs, they're much more likely to sort of descend into a pit of despair, to become withdrawn, and to actually help out less with housework and childcare, surprisingly. And so we can kind of, I think, anticipate and even see in among our peers or the people we're working with, that for some couples, what's unfolding before us is, going to create real problems that will land some couples into divorce court or headed towards, a breakup. So this is certainly, I think, a story for some Americans, particularly poor working class Americans, who've been hit harder by job losses in the last few weeks. Another kind of related point here is that there's not a lot of good data on this question, but there is a kind of preliminary analysis from The Economist that suggests that calls to police regarding domestic violence have moved upwards a bit since the beginning of the pandemic. And there's other work suggesting that this is particularly salient for unmarried couples, boyfriends, girlfriends, who don't have that sort of shared commitment to one another, and who are also more likely to be working class or poor. So this, I think, is another kind of serious concern to be, keeping an eye on amidst this pandemic. And then as you kind of think too about kind of the bigger implications of this pandemic for our future, if the economic recession that is now kind of falling upon our economy goes on, for months and obviously potentially even years, this will push our marriage rate, which is already, as you probably all know, at its lowest level ever, to even lower levels. And this would be particularly, I think, problematic, again, for poor working class couples who today are the least likely couples to get married. And what that means then longer term, from my perspective, and again, I kind of just giving you kind of the bad news first here, is that a large minority of young adults today, I think, will never marry. And I would say probably about a third of young adults. And this will be kind of a record share of American men and women who will never marry. And this has real implications, obviously, for them, for their emotional well-being, their social well-being, their economic well-being, and of course, for any kids that they might have as well. So that is the bad news from my vantage point. But that's not the only part of the story that I think we can think about right now, because I think there is a silver lining here, at least for particularly for married couples in America. And from my perspective, one dimension of that silver lining is, I think, the kind of the soulmate myth of marriage, which really gained legs or got legs in the 1970s. That was the me decade back in the 1970s. I think that soulmate myth, that sort of soulmate model of sort of what marriage is all about, is going to lose tremendous currency in the coming weeks and months and even years. And when I talk about the sort of the soulmate myth, what I'm talking about is the sort of idea that marriage is primarily about an intense emotional or romantic connection between two persons that's designed to make you feel happy, to make you fulfilled. That you kind of, you sort of see as life-giving. In other words, marriage is primarily just about sort of the welfare of the two adults that are a party to that marriage. So again, that sort of that myth took hold in the 70s, but I think today, particularly, it's going to prove less compelling for many married couples, many husbands and wives. Now, of course, it's important to acknowledge this is sort of like the soulmate idea is obviously the story of 1,000 songs and 100 self-help books. It's got a lot of, not to mention dozens of rom-coms. It's got a lot of kind of cultural currency out there. But I'm just going on this. But I think in a world marked by growing economic insecurity, by unprecedented unemployment, by the threat of reoccurring disease, and by increases in home production. Everything from people obviously schooling their kids at home to maybe creating a garden for the first time. From my perspective, kind of the meaning and practice of marriage is going to be sort of shifting in ways that sort of move away from that kind of emotional romantic idea and towards a more broadly gauged appreciation of the many different kinds of goods that marriage offers for adults, kids, and communities. So the silver lining here is that in the face of so much trauma and so much economic dislocation, I actually would predict that most marriages today will not collapse, and that many couples will kind of emerge from this difficulty, this pandemic, with a new appreciation of how much they depend upon their husband, their wife, and how much their marriage matters for them, but also for their kids and their kin. And there'll be kind of, again, a more, I think, broadly gauged understanding of the way in which marriage is advancing a number of different goods, not just sort of our emotional well-being in the moment. So more concretely, what I would predict is that we'll see marital commitment increasing in the wake of this pandemic. And I make that prediction because that's what we saw in the wake of the last Great Recession, around 2010, 2011, based upon the work that I've done with some colleagues on the last recession. So that's sort of one prediction here. The second prediction here is that we'll see actually divorce come down as Americans become more appreciative of sort of the practical value of marriage for them and their kids and their kin. And we've seen divorce rates actually come down since the last Great Recession by about 20%. And what this means practically is that for those folks who are marrying today, and obviously it's a more selective group, the sort of the risk of divorce is well below 1 and 2, well below 50%. So one scholar that I've talked to about this would put our risk of divorce now for first marriages at around 37, percent. So sort of the flip side of that point, obviously, is that a clear majority of marriages are going to make it. And I think that trend is going to be just reinforced by this pandemic and its economic fallout. I also would predict, as a consequence of this, that we'll see actually the share of kids being born into and raised in intact marriages increasing. And we've seen actually this trend emerge in the last couple of years. And I think it's sort of driven by a number of things, but one of the things it's driven by is a greater sense of caution about family formation among young adults today. And so, and caution too about sort of the risks of divorce as well. So again, I think the sort of larger economic climate here is going to make people even more cautious about having kids and getting divorced. And so from the kids' perspective, I think there will be some, at sort of at the average national level, some good outcomes here. And then if you kind of like think about this in a more holistic way, what I'm suggesting here is that more Americans will kind of gravitate, some in ways that are more explicit, particularly if they're religious, and some that are more implicit if they're just sort of like your average, well-educated professional type. They're going to be shifting, I think, even more than they have in recent years towards what I would call kind of a family-first model, where yes, marriage is probably about the communion between the two spouses, about that relationship certainly, but it's also seen to be about the welfare of your children. Recognizing that sort of the stability and the quality of your married life matters for your kids, not just for you, towards a growing appreciation of the value of commitment, both in terms of fidelity, but also in terms of, being together for life, till death do you part. Also kind of a growing appreciation too of the way in which, this is the fourth C here, marriage is about cash in part. Again, it's not just sort of this love-based relationship in a rom-com kind of way. It's really about, having a family financial foundation and recognizing that you're often able to better handle the challenges you face economically when you get and stay married, and you can rely not just on your spouse, but often too on your parents or your in-laws, to navigate difficult economic realities facing you. And the final point here is that couples who are embedded in communities of friends, or even more so faith communities that are supportive of their marriages, will be more likely to be not just stably married, but also happily married, just sort of benefiting from the social support they get from either friends or particularly from faith communities. My own research, for instance, has shown, as Alicia mentioned just a little while ago, that Black, Latino, and white couples who attend church regularly together are about 10 percentage points more likely to say that they're very happy in their marriages. And that may not seem like a huge effect to you, but actually from a social science perspective, it's a large effect. So again, I think we'll see these family-first marriages be obviously particularly common and particularly successful in church communities across the U.S. So to sort of wrap up my brief comments, and I'm obviously happy to take questions, what I'm suggesting here is that in the face of so much bad news on so many different fronts, and bad news too that hits our families in terms of obviously death and unemployment and domestic violence, for instance, there's a lot to be concerned about here. But I do think that as we kind of move through and beyond this pandemic and the recession, I think that's unfolding here, we're going to see that for those folks who are getting married, or for those folks who are currently married, that on average, in general, overall, that their marriages will emerge from all of this stronger, more stable, and more likely to supply a secure harbor for their kids. And that, obviously, from my perspective, is a quick summary of the silver lining. If you'd like to get more information on some of the things that I've been talking about this afternoon, you can follow me on Twitter at Wilcox NMP, or more importantly, you can find many articles at familystudies.org on both this question we've been addressing today and many other issues related to relationships, marriages, parenthood, and family life. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, and I'm not sure exactly how you guys want to do that, if you want to do it by chat or by some other kind of mechanism. And I can't hear you, Alicia.
Thank you. I think we have plenty of time to let people, thank you for that. I think that was really valuable, but I think we have plenty of time for people to just chime in and share.
Okay.
Some questions and speak up that we can hear. If you do speak up, I would just ask that you would say who you are and where you're from. That makes it helpful. I'll start with the first question, Brad. This is just fascinating in terms of thinking about the well-being of the robustness, if you will, of couples and how they're able to move forward in terms of that grid and even grow stronger. Are there any polls or surveys that kind of show some of that movement? Obviously we're in the midst of it right now, so we're not looking at long-term research, but just anything that's out there that's showing any indication of that trend?
Not yet. No, I've got a poll that is going to be going out, I think, in the next 2 or 3 weeks with some colleagues that will be looking at these questions. But no, nothing yet. Although, as I said before, we did see, in the wake of the Great Recession around 2010, 2011, both an immediate decline in divorce and then also an increase in commitment among married couples. So that's my precedent for this perspective today.
Mm-hmm. Barb has a question, and I guess I'll read it. Can anything be done to help those young folks with low incomes move toward marriage?
Yeah, I think a couple of things are important here. One is, particularly when talking about, teenagers and 20-somethings, trying to figure out if there are good vocational or apprenticeship programs, either in their local high schools or in their regions, or that are affiliated with local businesses. Because one of the things that sort of jumps out from the research is that, particularly when young men get vocational education or are in an apprenticeship, they see not just their wages spike, but their marriage rates spike. And I think it's partly for economic reasons, for obvious economic reasons, but also I think it speaks to their sense of self-worth. I think one big challenge facing a lot of young men in our culture who are not on the college track is that their intelligence, their professional aspirations, their gifts are often discounted or ignored or viewed in a derogatory way. And so I think one challenge is just connecting a lot of young adults, particularly young men, to better vocational training or apprenticeship opportunities that can give them not just, again, a sense of professional, not just professional opportunities, but a greater sense of self-worth. Also on that front, I think it's important too for young adults in low-income communities to be, connected to successful models, obviously, and they're certainly there, although they're more rare than they would be in upper middle class communities. But just to kind of help them see people who are maybe 10 or 15 years older than they are, who have kind of moved into marriage and figured out ways to navigate marriage on kind of a similar track that they're on as well.
To a certain extent, it seems like there's two different realities. You've got couples that perhaps have just more buffer, more resources, whether financial, emotional, community, social support, church life, all of these things. And they just seem to be protected, and it seems like they're going to get stronger. But then you've got the vulnerable, or the people who are at risk of divorce. Their relationships might just be tenuous to start with, and there's already volatility, or the low income component, the financial constraints. So the story seems to take a different. So it's just two realities. Is that something that is just being more augmented now in the current epidemic, because it was already that story anyways?
Yeah, it's
Or
certainly, yeah, it's certainly plausible, Alicia, and I think it's, well, I also don't want to I don't want to kind of leave you with this sort of false impression that just because you're upper middle class or because you're attending, church, that everything is rosy. We all know that's not the case. So it's important to also acknowledge that even for whites, for blacks, and for Hispanics who are attending church together, about 20% of them on any given Sunday, if you will, are unhappy, in their marriages. So they're a decent minority of folks who are struggling. So it's important for us to kind of be cognizant of the fact that we need to be also reaching out within our church communities and our nonprofits to people who are married and are faithful, but who are, for one reason or another, facing a difficult chapter in their marriage. But in terms of this broader divide that you're speaking about, Alicia, I think it is the case that because the pop culture does not reinforce ideas about commitment and communication and kind of taking the long-term view, and because the economy is turning so badly against many working class couples across the US, there isn't really like a good kind of cultural toolkit, nor is there the kind of economic foundation that would give a lot of working class couples today the ingredients for forging a strong and stable marriage.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a couple more interesting questions here that I'm going to go ahead and read them in order. Sarah's asking if there are tons and tons of comments out in social media about how divorce lawyers are going to make a killing when this is over. What's the best message to put out there to combat this message?
Yeah, I have seen a number of articles in the New York Post and other kind of popular newspapers that some people are going crazy, stir crazy literally with their spouse. And so I'm sure that there will be some divorces that kind of do emerge either for reasons related to being in quarantine or for reasons related to sort of the economic stress that this time is visiting upon us as a country. But I think sort of the message that we should kind of convey to the broader public and even to our local communities is that, look, folks, it's clearly the case that we've seen in the last few months that the government often is not going to be there for us, can't be there for us, won't be there for us, and that our employer is not there for us, won't be there for us, can't be there for us. So if you can't rely upon the government and you can't rely upon the market, who do you turn to? Well, I think classically people have turned to the church, and even more so, they've turned to their own family. And so I think the point I'm making here is that we should be attentive to the ways in which, we need to be, I think, more appreciative of and more attentive to our parents, our in-laws, our kin, our spouse, as both sources of support, and also that we should be attentive to the ways in which we need to be looking out for them, as well in this crisis.
Yeah, interesting question, that for sure. So Don Farr has another question. He's saying after 9/11, churches were filled to capacity and above, and it didn't last. So he says he's seen studies that indicate that church attendance online is double, triple, or more from last year. What are you aware of that might prevent that from happening as the COVID crisis unwinds?
So there's a new poll out from Pew that suggests that about 24% of Americans say that their faith has gotten stronger in the wake of this pandemic, and about 2% indicating it's gotten weaker. So, on net, when we have these major crises unfolding, and 9/11 is a good example, we do see kind of, I think, many folks turning to faith. But, as with 9/11, it was a pretty temporary blip in church going that we saw. So, I think it's not entirely clear about what how this will kind of net out once the quarantine lifts for religious communities and for churches in particular. But it is clear to me that if we can, if we do see churches seeing an uptick in participation, involvement, engagement, that would redound pretty strongly and well for marriages and families, as I think we all would appreciate on this particular call.
Yeah. So a good resource out there is Barna and Glue have come together, and they're doing this pulse polls every week, and definitely has information for the church community in terms of how they've got different polls that they're doing either for the leadership and the ministries or for the constituents and the members, and it is increasing. It's showing that people are, well, last time I checked, that digitally at least there's more exposure to that, and so the church is trying to grapple with how to church digitally and what does engagement look like, because it's definitely not just likes on Facebook or Facebook Live or views on the website, but how does discipleship look? So there's a lot of interesting conversations that the church is definitely having, and so I don't know that any of us can predict really what is going to happen in the future, because there has never been anything like this that we've experienced, that's for sure. So it's hard to have any historic, well, there's a couple of different reference points like 9/11 or here and there, but really nothing like this at this global rate. So we're all going to kind of have to see and watch how that plays out with the church or any other sector of community. Anybody else have any other comments or questions that they'd like to chime in the conversation so far? Well, we don't have any other closing thoughts. Brad, that you'd like to kind of leave with us before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think that the only thing that I would say is that I think, for some church communities, there has been kind of an implicit inability or unwillingness to sort of think about the financial well-being of church members in a sustained way. And I think kind of moving out of this particular crisis, what I would say is that churches should be a lot more, and ministry should be a lot more attentive to the importance of having resources or ministries that provide material assistance to church members, employment ideas in employment ministry, and also maybe even kind of something like a sort of a Craigslist, where people can find services and supports or barter, with fellow churchgoers, babysitting in return for plumbing, whatever it might be, so we can kind of be more intentional about sort of serving not just sort of the spiritual, the social, the emotional needs of members of our church communities, but also in this moment, serving their material needs as well. So I think that's one more thing that this pandemic might encourage or force, church communities to be more intentional on that front, which would be good.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brad. I found this incredibly encouraging. I'm going to just share a slide real quickly, if James, if you can let me share that slide, but just incredibly encouraging and just positive in light of just some of the other stories that we're otherwise hearing, like was mentioned earlier, like there's more divorces and things like that. And so I find that incredibly just uplifting, and to look at the silver lining of it all, and just kind of look at that light and see how we can tell that story much better. I'm thankful for all of you that joined us today and for your questions. I appreciate that, for your time. And I just have real quickly a couple of announcements that I'd love to share with you. There's also a poll that would love for you to take. If you could just take a minute, just a few seconds to fill that would be wonderful. And what I have on my screen, and hopefully you're able to see that, is just our next webinar that we're having, digital event that we're having in June. And this is with Scott Niederjohn, and he's looking at it from an economics point of view. So he's the Senior VP for Cooperative Education and Economic Development. and for the Charlotte and Walter Kohler Professor of Economics. And he's going to just looking at a little bit more about behavioral economics and how financial decisions are made around that. So I think that's going to be incredibly valuable, and would encourage you to join us for that, and just stay tuned as we share more information to how to register for that. And I just want to highlight real quickly just some of our efforts as it relates to COVID with Family Bridges. Just thank you so much, all of you who have come along with us to pivot. We've been working, to offer so many workshops and virtual programs, or couples communication, parenting, or different classes online, precisely so that the folks that are on the brink and they're having struggles, or that we're able to bring that community support and just give them some of the skill sets in order to be able to deal with some of those challenging events. And so thank you for our team that's out there providing so many wonderful programming. And in order to support families as well, we've launched several different campaigns, working with our different champions to be able to equip them, but also with some of the families. So some of the families that are taking all of our programs like parenting, couples communication, and financial, and they're doing those workshops. We're working with a subscription company that's doing STEM learning to directly deliver some really enriching activities for the kids, because as we all know, all of that stress at home is really overwhelming. So we're providing that. And so if you'd like to learn more about all those initiatives and you'd like to support that, there you can go to our website at familybridgesusa.org, and we are collecting donations for those kinds of supports. And so we welcome for you to join us in that effort. So thank you. And with that, I just hope you enjoy the beautiful sunny weather that we're having in Chicago. We don't get that many. So get some of that vitamin D, and we'll stay connected. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Alicia.